Grace Carter had barely fastened her first-class seatbelt when a flight attendant ordered her to leave. A wealthy passenger claimed someone like her could not belong there. Grace showed her boarding pass, but the argument ended with security escorting her toward economy. She never raised her voice. 20 minutes after takeoff, however, the cockpit door opened. Captain Jackson Reed stared down the aisle, spotted Grace, and froze. Then he walked directly toward her, straightened instinctively, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sir, I did not know you were aboard." Suddenly, nobody in the cabin was laughing. If you want to know why the captain called this single mother Sir, stay with this story until the end. The terminal at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was quiet in the early morning light, the kind of quiet that settled over travelers still nursing their first coffee of the day. Grace Carter moved through the crowd in a plain navy jacket and dark trousers, a worn leather bag slung over one shoulder. There was nothing about her that suggested wealth or status. No designer luggage trailed behind her. No assistant walked at her side. Though her ticket granted her access to the private lounge, she walked past its glass doors without a glance, choosing instead a quiet corner near her gate where she could sit undisturbed. What set Grace apart was not visible at first, but it revealed itself in small, almost involuntary gestures. She paused near a window and checked the wind direction without thinking, the way someone might glance at a clock out of habit. She watched a ground crew member inspect a cargo door with more attention than most passengers ever paid to such things. When she finally passed through the boarding gate, her eyes flicked briefly to the tail number painted near the door, and she committed it to memory before she had even consciously decided to. While she waited near the jet bridge, her phone rang. It was the woman who watched her daughter during long trips, calling to confirm the evening pickup schedule. Grace kept her voice low and warm, promising she would be home by tomorrow night, no later. She did not linger on the call. Before she slipped the phone back into her bag, she opened it once more and looked at a small photograph tucked behind her identification card. A child's gap-toothed smile caught mid-law. She smiled faintly, then closed the bag and stepped forward with the rest of the line. Her seat was 2A, first class, on a flight to Washington arranged by a federal agency for a meeting she had been asked to attend. Grace had never cared much for the comfort of a wide seat or a warm towel before takeoff. She cared only for the quiet hours it would give her to review the folder resting in her bag, pages of notes she had been organizing for weeks. She settled into her seat, buckled her belt, and pulled out her materials, ready to disappear into her work for the length of the flight. She had barely opened the folder when a woman named Catherine Madison arrived at the row. Catherine glanced at her boarding pass, then at the seat number stenciled above Grace's head, then back at Grace herself, her eyes moving slowly, deliberately, taking in the plain jacket and the tired leather bag. Something in her expression shifted, a private judgment forming before a single word had been exchanged between them. Grace noticed the look but said nothing, returning her attention to the folder as the cabin continued to fill around her. Catherine Madison had the seat beside Grace, 2B, and it did not take long for her discomfort to surface. She shifted in her seat, glanced sideways more than once, and finally spoke, her tone still polished with the thin courtesy of someone unused to being questioned. She asked, almost gently, whether Grace might be in the wrong cabin, whether perhaps there had been some confusion with her ticket. Grace answered without irritation, producing her boarding pass and holding it out so Catherine could read the seat assignment for herself. 2A. Nothing about it was incorrect. Catherine studied the pass longer than necessary as though searching for an error that was not there. Unsatisfied, she raised her hand and summoned a flight attendant. Charlotte Hayes, the lead attendant for the flight, arrived promptly and reviewed Grace's documentation with practiced efficiency. Everything matched. The ticket was valid, the seat assignment correct, the payment processed weeks earlier through the Federal Travel Office that had arranged Grace's trip. By every reasonable measure, the matter should have ended there, a brief misunderstanding resolved in under a minute. Charlotte had worked this route for years and had seen every version of this exchange before, the quiet passenger, the loud passenger, the honest confusion, and the manufactured one. She recognized almost immediately that nothing about Grace's documentation was in question. Still, she hesitated, aware of the growing line of boarding passengers behind her and the low murmur already spreading through the front rows. A decision needed to be made quickly, and quick decisions, she would later admit to herself, were rarely the wisest ones. But a small technical error complicated things. The airline's internal passenger system had not fully synced with a last-minute booking change, leaving the display for seat 2A slightly out of step with the most current manifest. Grace's boarding pass remained entirely valid, yet the discrepancy on the screen gave Catherine something to seize upon. She pressed harder, her voice rising just enough for nearby passengers to hear. First class, she said, had standards, and it seemed unreasonable to let just anyone occupy a premium seat on the strength of a ticket displayed on a phone. Grace remained composed throughout. She suggested calmly that Charlotte contact the gate agent to resolve the manifest discrepancy properly rather than continue debating in the aisle. It was a reasonable request, but the boarding window was closing fast, the departure slot tightening by the minute, and a ground manager eager to avoid a delay made a decision that would prove deeply unwise. Grace would be moved to an open seat in economy while the airline verified the paperwork after takeoff, a temporary fix offered as though it solved anything at all. Grace asked one simple question. Was her boarding pass valid? Charlotte, uncomfortable, admitted that it was. Grace asked a second question quieter than the first. Then why was she the one being moved? Nobody answered directly, and the silence that followed seemed to press down on the entire front of the cabin. A few rows back, passengers had begun to notice the tension without fully understanding its cause. Some assumed Grace had done something wrong simply because she was the one standing while everyone else remained seated. Others looked away, uninterested in a dispute that did not concern them. Catherine, for her part, folded her hands in her lap with the satisfied air of someone who believed the matter had been settled correctly, unaware of how badly she had misjudged the woman beside her. Grace did not raise her voice. She did not reach for her phone to record the moment or demand to speak with a supervisor. She simply began gathering her folder and her bag, her stillness somehow louder than any protest could have been, and that quiet dignity made what happened next feel far heavier than shouting ever could. Because Grace had not moved right away while she waited for a proper explanation, someone at the gate called for airport security, and within minutes a uniformed officer arrived at the front of the cabin. Grace did not resist or argue with him. She simply stood, gathered her belongings, and prepared to walk to the seat she had been assigned. But the sight of a security officer standing beside a woman in first class carried its own quiet accusation, and several passengers glances as though Grace had been caught doing something wrong rather than simply asking a fair question. Catherine gave a small, satisfied shake of her head, as if the presence of security confirmed everything she had suspected from the start. Somewhere behind her, another passenger murmured that perhaps the woman had booked the wrong fare entirely, a remark meant to be quiet but pitched just loud enough to reach Grace's ears. Grace heard it clearly. She did not turn, did not correct the stranger, did not offer any defense of herself at all. She simply reached for the handle of her bag and rose from her seat with the same composure she had carried since boarding. Before she stepped into the aisle, Grace paused beside Charlotte and spoke in a voice too soft for anyone else to catch. She told the attendant that she hoped, next time, Charlotte would verify the truth before choosing the passenger who seemed easiest to remove. It was not delivered with anger, it landed with far more weight because of that. Charlotte felt the words settle somewhere she would not be able to shake for the rest of the flight. A small stone lodged where her confidence used to sit. Grace was walked back to seat 27C, deep in the economy cabin, and settled in without complaint. The story could easily have collapsed into a simple tale of class resentment, but that was not quite what was happening. A young flight attendant, newer to the job and clearly uneasy with what she had witnessed, quietly brought Grace a bottle of water and murmured an apology of her own. Grace thanked her warmly. Whatever frustration she carried, she did not let it fall on someone who had no part in the decision. Once the aircraft climbed to its cruising path, Grace opened her folder again. The cover held only a handful of words, a title referencing National Aviation Safety Review, nothing more. When the passenger beside her glanced over, Grace turned the folder face down and let her attention drift toward the window instead, unwilling to invite further questions she had no interest in answering that day. A small tremor passed through the cabin as the plane continued its climb, barely noticeable to anyone around her. Most passengers did not react at all. Grace lifted her head a full 2 seconds before anyone else seemed to register that anything had happened. It was not fear that moved her. It was recognition, the kind that came from years spent listening for exactly this sort of sound. Her eyes drifted toward the left wing, and something in her expression quietly changed. About 20 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft leveled off at its cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into the familiar hum of a routine flight. Most passengers relaxed, pulling out books or closing their eyes for a nap. Grace did not relax. She noticed three things in quick succession that no one else around her seemed to register at all. First came an unusual vibration, faint but distinct, running through the floor beneath her feet. Then came a subtle shift in the sound of the ventilation system, a pitch that did not belong to the steady rhythm she had heard only minutes earlier. Finally, the cabin lights flickered once, so briefly that most passengers would have dismissed it as imagination. Grace pressed the call button. Charlotte arrived a moment later, still visibly uneasy from the earlier confrontation over the seating dispute. Grace did not bring up what had happened before. She asked only one question, delivered in the flat, precise language of someone who understood exactly what she was asking. She wanted to know whether the cockpit had issued any hydraulic or electrical advisory. Charlotte froze for a beat. That was not a question an ordinary passenger would think to ask, let alone phrase so specifically. Charlotte asked carefully what Grace did for a living. Grace answered simply that she had spent a long time working around aircraft, offering nothing more specific than that. Rather than press further, Grace asked Charlotte to relay a short, precise message to the flight deck. She wanted the crew to know the exact moment the vibration occurred, where it had felt strongest, and how many times the cabin lights had flickered. Charlotte hesitated only briefly before agreeing to carry the message forward. There was something in Grace's tone that made refusal feel unwise. It was not forceful. It carried the calm certainty of someone who had asked these exact questions many times before, in rooms far more consequential than an economy cabin. Charlotte found herself nodding before she had fully decided to comply, already turning toward the forward galley to relay the details exactly as Grace had described them. Inside the cockpit, Captain Jackson Reed listened as Charlotte relayed the description over the intercom. He asked who had reported it. Charlotte answered that it was a passenger named Grace Carter, seated in 27C. For a moment, Jackson said nothing at all. He asked Charlotte to repeat the name, certain he had misheard her the first time. Carter. He requested the passenger manifest immediately, scanning it until he found the full entry. Grace E. Carter. Jackson removed his headset without another word. His first officer asked where he was going, and Jackson offered no real explanation, only that there was something he needed to confirm for himself. He rose from his seat, straightened his jacket out of pure instinct, and reached for the cockpit door, his mind already racing back through years of memory toward a name he had never expected to hear on a passenger manifest again. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Jackson Reed stepped into the aisle. Passengers near the front assumed he was making a routine check of the cabin, the kind of walk-through captains sometimes did to stretch their legs on longer flights. But Jackson did not stop in first class. He walked straight through it, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the rows of leather seats. Catherine noticed him immediately, sitting up a little straighter as he passed, though he did not so much as glance in her direction. Charlotte followed a few steps behind, uncertain what she was about to witness. Jackson continued through the cabin, past business class, past the curtain separating the sections until he reached row 27. Grace sat with her folder open on her lap, unaware of the figure now standing at the edge of her row. Jackson recognized her instantly. Years earlier, during a joint safety initiative involving multiple branches of service, Grace had been one of the most respected accident investigators he had ever worked alongside, a reputation built through quiet competence rather than rank alone. Jackson straightened his posture the way old habits sometimes returned without warning. Then he spoke, his voice carrying just far enough for the surrounding rows to hear clearly. He said, "Sir, I did not know you were aboard." There was no immediate need to explain why a grown man addressed a woman with that particular word. The mystery of it hung in the air, unresolved, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Grace looked up, faintly surprised. "There are no ranks left, Jackson," she said. "To me there still are," he answered simply. A few heads turned in nearby rows, curious about the exchange they had only partially overheard. Catherine, still seated in first class, strained to catch more of the conversation but could make out only fragments carried faintly down the aisle. Charlotte stood frozen at the edge of the scene, the earlier apology she owed Grace suddenly feeling far heavier than she had realized. Jackson asked what exactly she had heard. Grace described the vibration with precision, the timing, the location, the pattern of the flickering lights. Jackson's expression sharpened immediately. He knew from long experience that Grace never raised a concern without solid reason behind it. After a brief exchange in the clipped, technical language too professional smooter, Jackson turned toward Charlotte. He asked, plainly, why Colonel Carter had been seated in economy at all. It was the first time her former rank had been spoken aloud in the cabin. Charlotte had no answer ready. Grace, sensing the tension rising, stepped in before Jackson could push further. "The matter of the seat could wait," she said. "The aircraft needed to be checked first." It was a small moment, but it deepened the respect Jackson already carried for her, a reminder of exactly the kind of judgment that had made her so valuable years earlier. Down the aisle, Ryan Hunter, seated quietly in first class, watched the entire exchange with growing interest. He had said nothing throughout the earlier dispute over the seat, choosing to stay out of a conflict that seemed, at the time, beneath his attention. Now he found himself leaning slightly into the aisle, trying to piece together why a senior captain would walk the length of the aircraft simply to address a passenger in economy with such evident deference. Whatever the reason, he sensed it mattered more than anyone around him yet understood. Jackson returned to the cockpit, but the exchange he left behind did not stay contained. Within minutes, quiet murmurs had spread through the cabin, passengers leaning toward one another to compare what they thought they had overheard. Catherine asked Charlotte directly what the captain had meant by the word colonel. Charlotte, still shaken, admitted she did not fully know and excused herself to check the passenger service records, hoping to find some explanation that made sense of what she had just witnessed. A few rows ahead, Ryan Hunter, vice president of operations for the airline, quietly opened his device and began searching the company's internal systems. He had recognized the name the moment Jackson spoke it, though he had not yet placed the full context. What he found within a few minutes startled him. Grace Carter was not a public figure in any conventional sense. No headlines, no widely recognized name outside certain circles. But within the aviation safety community, her record carried unusual weight. She had served nearly 2 decades in the Air Force, specializing in flight safety, emergency operations, and accident investigation. Her work had contributed to a major review that ultimately changed procedures across a large fleet of commercial and military aircraft, a project still referenced in training materials years later. After leaving active service, she had become a consultant to a federal aviation board, called upon whenever an especially difficult safety question needed careful, experienced eyes. The trip to Washington that day, Ryan realized, was for a hearing concerning commercial aviation safety standards, the very field in which Grace had spent her career. The weight of what had happened settled over Ryan slowly, then all at once. His airline had removed a senior aviation safety expert from a validly booked seat, on a flight she might very well have some professional connection to, over nothing more than a passenger's discomfort and a staff member's rushed judgment. It was not merely embarrassing. It was the exact kind of failure Grace had spent her career trying to prevent within the industry, a breakdown of process at the most basic level. Grace, for her part, remained entirely unaware that Ryan was seated only a few rows away, unaware of the search now underway on his device, unaware that her professional history was quietly becoming common knowledge among the crew. Her attention had shifted elsewhere. In the cockpit, a small advisory had appeared on the instrument panel, nothing severe enough to declare an emergency, but troubling in one specific way. It matched, almost exactly, the pattern Grace had described only minutes earlier. Jackson stared at the readout for a long moment, the pieces of a much larger concern beginning to take shape in his mind. Charlotte returned to the galley and stood quietly for a moment, replaying the conversation in her head. She thought of the boarding pass she had checked twice, the manifest discrepancy that had never truly justified what followed, and the calm, measured way Grace had accepted a decision that was never hers to accept. It was a heavier weight than Charlotte had expected to carry so early into the flight, and it settled uncomfortably beside the growing sense that something far more serious was now unfolding around them. Roughly 40 minutes later, the aircraft encountered a second, more concerning irregularity. A hydraulic system began showing fluctuating pressure readings, and the autopilot briefly disengaged before reconnecting on its own moments later. Neither event, taken alone, signaled disaster, but together, layered atop the earlier signs, the combination weighed heavily on Jackson's mind. His first officer worked steadily through the standard checklist, calling out readings that mostly fell within acceptable limits, technically fine, yet carrying an unease that neither pilot could fully shake. Jackson found himself thinking back to a simulated failure scenario from years earlier, one Grace had personally analyzed during a joint training review. In that case, the danger had never come from a single failed component. It came from the interaction between several smaller issues at once: a faulty sensor, fluctuating hydraulic behavior, and vibration patterns that on their own seemed harmless but together painted a very different picture. The similarity to what he was now seeing was impossible to ignore. Jackson asked Charlotte to bring Grace forward, closer to the cockpit area, so the crew could speak with her more directly. Grace hesitated at first. She was not a member of the flight crew, and she understood clearly where the boundaries of her role had to remain. Jackson was careful in how he framed the request. He did not want her hands on any control. He wanted her ears, her judgment, a second set of trained eyes reading the numbers his own crew called out to her from just inside the cockpit doorway. Grace asked a series of precise questions. At what speed had the vibration first appeared? Did it change when engine thrust was reduced? Did the hydraulic pressure drop at the same moment as the vibration, or with a slight delay? Was there any automatic correction to the aircraft's heading during the fluctuation? Each answer she received narrowed the possibilities further, and within a few minutes she had formed a working theory. The trouble did not appear to originate from engine failure at all. It pointed instead toward a specific control assembly, a detail easy to overlook without the right pattern of questions. She recommended against repeatedly resetting the affected system, explaining that doing so could mask the very pattern the crew needed to observe clearly. Jackson understood immediately what she meant. Rather than continue toward Washington and risk the situation escalating further over several more hours of flight, he made the decision to divert to the nearest suitable airport, choosing caution over convenience without a moment of hesitation. The cabin was informed shortly afterward that the flight would be changing course as a technical precaution, a phrase chosen deliberately to avoid unnecessary alarm. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances, but no panic followed. Catherine, still seated in first class, finally began to understand something she had dismissed only hours earlier. The woman she had so easily judged and pushed aside might be the very reason this danger had been caught before it had the chance to become something far worse. Charlotte moved through the cabin delivering the announcement in a calm, practiced voice, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the intercom handset. She glanced once toward the rear of the plane, toward the row where Grace now sat with the crew's attention fixed firmly on her judgment rather than her boarding pass. It struck Charlotte, in that moment, just how completely the balance of the flight had shifted and how little any of it had to do with luck. Ryan Hunter watched the diversion unfold with a mixture of professional concern and quiet relief. Whatever internal failure the aircraft was experiencing, it had been caught early, identified with a precision that came only from real expertise rather than guesswork. He made a note, mentally at first and then on his device, to ensure that whatever had gone wrong with the seating decision earlier would be examined with the same rigor now being applied to the mechanical fault above his head. Grace did not take control of the aircraft, and nothing about what followed strayed into the unrealistic. There was no dramatic moment of a passenger seizing the controls or stepping into a pilot's seat. Her role remained precisely what it had been from the beginning, a trained expert reading the situation and offering guidance, standing near the cockpit doorway while the actual work of flying stayed entirely in the hands of the crew who belonged there. As the aircraft began its descent toward the diversion airport, the hydraulic warning grew more pronounced. Jackson and his first officer worked methodically through the official checklist prescribed for exactly this kind of failure. Grace, listening closely to the numbers relayed to her, recalled a service bulletin from years earlier describing a nearly identical failure pattern in a related aircraft system. She asked the crew to check one specific reading, a value not always emphasized in standard training but familiar to her from long experience with exactly this kind of fault. The result confirmed her suspicion. A secondary system needed to be isolated before landing to prevent the fault from compounding further. Jackson already had a checklist branch prepared for this contingency, but Grace's insight allowed him to identify the correct path more quickly than he might have otherwise, saving valuable time during a descent where every minute mattered. The cabin crew began preparing the aircraft for a precautionary landing, moving through their duties with quiet, practiced efficiency. His first officer, a younger pilot still building his experience with situations of this kind, later admitted that watching Grace work through the problem felt like a masterclass compressed into a handful of minutes. She never once raised her voice or pushed past the boundaries of her role. She simply asked the right question at the right moment, again and again, until the picture became clear enough for the crew to act on with full confidence. Grace returned to her seat in economy. It mattered, in a story built on restraint rather than spectacle, that she buckled her belt like any other passenger and waited alongside everyone else for what would happen next. Charlotte took the jump seat nearby, and before settling in, she looked over at Grace one final time. "I am sorry," she said quietly. Grace answered simply that they should focus on landing first. The apology could wait until the ground was beneath them again. The aircraft made its final approach. Cabin lights dimmed as instructed. A hush fell over every row, the kind of silence that carries its own particular weight. Catherine gripped the armrest beside her without quite realizing she had done so. Ryan watched from several rows ahead, his attention now fixed entirely on the woman in economy who had somehow become, without ever raising her voice, the calmest presence on the entire aircraft. Grace remained composed, though beneath her folded hands she held the small photograph of her daughter, her fingers pressing gently against its worn edges as the ground rose steadily to meet them. The landing came harder than usual but well within safe limits, the wheels striking the runway and the engines reversing thrust with a controlled, deliberate force. As the aircraft slowed to taxi speed, a wave of released tension moved through the cabin, audible in the collective exhale that seemed to pass from row to row. Jackson's voice came over the intercom moments later, calm and steady. They had landed safely, he said, thanks to the coordination of the entire crew and the presence of an exceptional expert aboard the flight. He did not exaggerate her role. He simply named it honestly. Ground crews met the aircraft at a dedicated gate, and a technical team began its inspection almost immediately. Preliminary findings confirmed a failure pattern consistent with everything Grace had flagged hours earlier. Had the flight continued for several more hours toward its original destination, the safety margin surrounding the fault could have narrowed considerably. Grace never claimed the aircraft had been on the verge of catastrophe. What she offered instead was more measured and in its own way more meaningful. Her early observations had allowed the crew to identify a developing pattern and divert well before that margin ever became a real concern. Once the doors opened, Ryan Hunter approached Grace directly and introduced himself. He explained that he had already reviewed the incident from earlier in the flight. Her boarding pass, he confirmed, had been entirely valid from the start. The confusion had originated from a manifest that had not fully synchronized after a late booking change, a technical oversight that explained the discrepancy but did nothing to excuse what followed. A system error was one thing. The decision made by staff members responding to that error was something else entirely. Charlotte admitted, without being pressed, that she had chosen the easiest path rather than the correct one. Faced with a wealthy, insistent passenger and a closing departure window, she had moved the person least likely to cause further disruption rather than the person who was actually in the wrong. It was an honest admission, delivered without excuses, and it seemed to cost her something to say it aloud. Catherine, too, was left facing the truth of her own behavior. Nobody raised their voice at her. Nobody demanded she be removed from the aircraft in some symbolic act of reversal. Grace looked at her evenly and offered only one observation spoken without malice. "Not everyone who looks ordinary lives an ordinary life," she said. Catherine felt the weight of the words settle over her, a quiet embarrassment far more effective than any public confrontation could have been. Grace did not linger on the moment. She had no interest in prolonging someone else's discomfort simply because she had the standing to do so now. Around them, ground staff moved briskly between the aircraft and the terminal, coordinating with the technical inspection team while passengers waited nearby for updates on their onward travel. Jackson emerged from the cockpit a short while later, his uniform jacket still slightly rumpled from the tension of the flight, and made his way toward Grace and Ryan. The three of them spoke quietly near the jet bridge, their conversation unhurried despite the chaos still unfolding around the gate. For the first time since boarding that morning, Grace allowed herself a small measure of relief, aware that the day's events, however strange, had ended exactly as they needed to. Ryan offered to help Grace file a formal complaint, assuring her that the airline would investigate the matter thoroughly. Grace agreed, but she attached one condition to her cooperation. She did not want Charlotte turned into a scapegoat if the deeper problem actually lived within the system itself. Charlotte had made the wrong call, Grace acknowledged plainly, and she needed to own that. But a process that pressured staff to prioritize speed over verification deserved just as much scrutiny as any individual decision made under that pressure. Grace proposed 3 specific changes. The passenger manifest needed to synchronize directly before the doors closed, eliminating the kind of discrepancy that had caused the confusion in the first place. No passenger holding a valid boarding pass should ever be downgraded simply because of an unverified dispute with another traveler. And cabin crews needed a clear escalation protocol to follow in these situations, something concrete to rely on instead of judgment calls made under pressure and a ticking departure clock. Ryan listened closely, visibly impressed. Grace had every reason to focus solely on what had been done to her. Instead, her attention remained fixed on preventing the same failure from happening to someone else entirely. Charlotte apologized to Grace directly, without hedging or minimizing what she had done. Grace accepted the apology with the same steadiness she had shown throughout the day. Catherine attempted an apology as well, stumbling slightly over her words. Grace offered only a brief reply. Next time, she said, ask before deciding where someone belongs. There was no dramatic reversal, no moment of public humiliation returned in kind. Whatever satisfaction Grace found that day came not from watching others suffer, but from the quiet certainty that her dignity had never actually depended on their approval in the first place. Ryan promised her the recommendations would be reviewed at the highest level of the airline's safety office, not filed away and forgotten once the immediate embarrassment had passed. Grace thanked him but made clear she was not seeking recognition or compensation for what had happened. She simply wanted a system that would not repeat the same mistake with the next passenger who happened to look, on the surface, like someone easy to overlook. That, to her, was the only outcome worth pursuing from a day that had otherwise gone badly wrong. Hours later, Grace boarded a different aircraft bound for Washington, her first-class seat restored without a single further question. She chose the same seat she had originally been assigned, unwilling to let the day's events change the plans she had made weeks earlier. Before boarding, Jackson found her near the gate, still in uniform, his shift long since finished but his conversation with her clearly unfinished in his own mind. He explained the word he had used earlier that day. Years before, in the unit where they had once served together, officers under her command had fallen into the habit of addressing her that way during moments of real pressure, a reflex of respect that had little to do with formal protocol. Jackson admitted he had simply never managed to let the habit go, even years after they had both left that world behind. Grace laughed softly. I have been out of uniform a long time, she told him. Jackson shook his head. Some things do not disappear just because the rank gets packed away, he said. Grace boarded her new flight without fanfare. No one in the terminal recognized the woman with the worn leather bag as someone who had, only hours earlier, helped a flight crew catch a developing failure before it became something far more dangerous. She did not need them to know. Before the doors closed, she checked her phone one last time. A message waited from her daughter asking simply whether she would be home the next day. Grace typed back a single word. Always. The aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its slow taxi toward the runway, carrying her forward into an ordinary evening that, to everyone around her, would remain entirely unremarkable. What happened that day left behind a simple truth, one easy to forget in a world quick to judge by appearances. A person's worth is never measured by the seat they occupy, the clothes they wear, or the assumptions strangers make in passing. Sometimes the one pushed hardest to the back of the room is exactly the person everyone ends up depending on when things start to go wrong. If this story reminded you that quiet people often carry the deepest strength, share it with someone who needs that reminder today. Grace never asked for recognition, only fairness, and that quiet dignity is worth carrying with you long after the story ends. Kindness costs nothing, but judging too quickly can cost far more than anyone expects. The next time you find yourself sizing up a stranger by their clothes or their manner, remember that the calmest person in the room is sometimes the one holding everything together. Take a moment today to treat every person you meet with the same respect you would want for yourself, regardless of what they are wearing or how ordinary they might seem at first glance.